All right. So I think I'm going to get started. I know more people are going to be coming on board. We already have a little bit of a full house. So let me go ahead and get started and tell you, here's my agenda. Let me put it out there. One, I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit of information about myself and how I got involved with this. My goal in this call is to answer a lot of questions. So I don't want to take up a lot of time on that side of things, but I do want to give you, again, a little bit of information on my role and why I started with this. I also want to talk briefly about infections and show you a couple of slides just to kind of orient some of the focuses that we have when it comes to strategies. And then I want to turn things over and answer questions. We routinely have questions about what is the program that we offer, how long does it last, what's involved, what kinds of things do we use. Not only are they good questions, but I'm glad to have the chance to go through it. And so after going through a couple of pieces of information that I think are going to be useful, I'll turn things over and I welcome you to ask anything that you'd like. My name is Amy Jaramillo. I am the scientific director over here. So my background is science. I'm not a physician. Dr. Farrow is the medical director that's over here. We have other MDs that are here from time to time, including anesthesiology. My role as the scientific director is to understand the pathways that are involved in neuroinflammatory disease, things that have been used, why they've been used successfully, why they haven't been used successfully, and to come up with new strategies. Proper title should be is probably medical strategist, right? That's kind of where I fit into this equation. The tagline that we use, the bridge between science and the practice of medicine, I would tell you, I think that's a true fact. We're pretty good at understanding the science behind things. So what's happening in the cell? Why is that happening? How do we want to look to correct the cell or improve damage, restore functionality at different levels of the cell, whether it's organelles or pathways, and then match a medical approach to it. So I personally think science belongs in the practice of medicine. Granted, I'm biased. But I think getting to root cause, and that's really where we are as a center, understanding not things from the disease perspective, right? Not the organ that's affected, not the organ system. So in this case, not the brain or the spinal cord, not the central nervous system. Instead, looking at the cells and understanding cellular dysfunction, cellular damage, and how that cellular dysfunction leads to organ dysfunction, leads to system dysfunction. So if the cells are the focus, and then the question is, would that cause changes in the brain? And then would that cause changes in the central nervous system? So from a pathway and cellular standpoint, that's, as a clinic, where we are always going to be. And by comparison, we're never going to really look at it from the endpoint, motor neuron disease. Instead, we're going to look at what is causing motor neuron damage. A couple of things to tell you about myself. I'll tell you my background. I started out in neurogenetics. I spent about 8-9 years there, understanding the genetic predispositions that led to a large number of neurologic and neurodegenerative diseases. So at that point, being very focused in several of the dystrophies, Alzheimer's, spinal muscular atrophy, spinal cerebellar ataxia, Huntington's, again, looking at them from the genetic perspective. What are the predisposing risk factors? And it was a very interesting place to be. I'm thinking about a time, I mean, not date myself, but at the same time, let me put a timetable on there for you guys. It was 90s and early 2000s. And then I switched gears and focused on intraoperative central nervous system procedures. I was working at that point for Medtronic, a large medical device company. They were looking to come on label with the FDA for stimulation deep in the brain for movement disorders, dystonia, and Parkinson's. And it was really in its infancy. And so we did a lot of mapping of different areas of the brain at that point, putting microphones down and actually hearing the firing patterns in a lot of different areas of the brain and in the basal ganglia. And then putting leads in. So for me, I did a lot of instruction and have been in a lot of neurosurgical cases. I'd love to give a number. I'm not even sure what that number is, but it's a very, very large number. And so the two sides of the spectrum, one for me was determining what somebody was at high risk of developing, but not intervening. Basically just figuring out what the risk factor was. And in a lot of the genetic predispositions, the risk factor is very, very significant. If you have the gene, then it is very likely you'll develop the disease if you live long enough, high penetrance. So the reason I left that, it felt like there has to be a better way of changing that. That shouldn't be destiny, and it wouldn't be if somebody could intercede. And then when I got to the other side of it, right, so that was the surgical intervention to improve brain control and change firing patterns to control disease. Still, it felt like that's the endpoint. So what I was just describing, getting the disease, not really knowing what's causing it and trying to find solutions. So both kind of being on either side. And when I decided I wanted to be more of the problem solver, if you have a genetic predisposition, that doesn't mean you live out that destiny. If you already have that destiny, doesn't mean it can't be reversed. So I had that going on and decided to open a functional clinic. For me as a scientist, I am not a physician. I do not have an MD license. So sometimes people will ask me, it means I always work in concert with a medical team and there's always an MD. And when I started, it was with a neurologist. I was very focused on that time with an Emory study that came out looking at protecting brain function shortly after traumatic brain injury by using luteinizing hormone and specifically testosterone. So I started a clinic with that in mind and was able to bring neuropsych on board to measure improvements in brain function after traumatic brain injury by using a number of different things, nootropics being one of them. So ways to improve neuron firing or neuron plasticity or neuron survivability, the use of luteinizing hormones like testosterone to improve brain function. I would tell you during that same time, and that was 2009 when I started that, on a personal note, I know for a lot of people that have motor neuron disease, I of course understand what you've gone through, which is meeting with neurology and being told that this is an incurable or untreatable disease. I think what really spurred me on my dad, I lost my dad in 2016, cancer. What I would tell you is about 20 years before my dad was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Turns out it wasn't terminal, right? And he lived 20 additional years. Ultimately, it was cancer that caused him to pass, but 20 years. I went into functional just thinking terminal doesn't mean terminal. Terminal means solutions haven't been figured out. And I feel like had we listened, my dad, my mom and I, my brother, had we listened to that initial approach, we wouldn't have looked for treatment. And at that time, my dad would have passed of terminal cancer. And so I'm always weary with the idea of it's a disease that could never be treated or there are no solutions. My mom has some spinal cord injury and same kind of thing, limited options that now kind of looking at it, there are more options than initially thought. All right, so fast forward this whole thing to 2017, and this is where I got involved in motor neuron disease. I was already working with a lot of people to try and figure out root cause. I'd already seen a lot of neuroinflammatory diseases, Parkinson's, MS, in the clinic, had already had a lot of success navigating cellular dysfunction and correcting it, diabetes, hormone dysfunction, so all kinds of things. And for me, as kind of a strategist, that's my passion, trying to figure out where the damage is in the cell. Neurology had seen somebody that had motor neuron disease and had just diagnosed with the diagnosis of ALS and sent that patient, who was Gunther, over to somebody else in town to assess further. And it was that person, John Schreiber, that called me and said, listen, I'm seeing somebody. He's got a diagnosis of ALS. I want to take a look. And I had two people that had come to the office prior to that, same diagnosis. I had no idea of what options were or what solutions would look like. And like most other people, felt like there probably weren't good solutions. Gunther came in 2017. I remember we spoke about the fact that I really didn't have a clear understanding of the neurologic changes, but it made sense to start doing something versus doing nothing, and then kind of working through a cellular strategy. He reversed and was a recognized reversal by 2019. The reason I tell you that is I had not intended to find myself here as essentially a medical strategist in the world of motor neuron. Given the fact that my dad had been diagnosed incorrectly with terminal disease, he was treatable. He was actually treatable. The person that did diagnose him said, not only are you not treatable, but we are not going to do any treatment. So I'm sure that sounds familiar to a lot of people. And it took an awful lot on my family side, just like it does for you, to get past that hurdle. And so once I had that reversal, I looked at this whole thing very differently. I'd already had the experience with my dad. I already had one person that had reversed. And it just felt like, I don't know, let me take a look at this whole thing, and let's put a medical team together and let's start looking at clinical trials, why they aren't working. How come, or why would you expect to have a lot of science, a lot of data, a lot of money going behind the idea of trialing a medication, and then to have this enormous rate of failure? It doesn't seem like the science is wrong. It seems like it's not the right combinations, or it doesn't really take into consideration the number of areas that need to be addressed in the cell. And so for me, it just became a question of looking at the theory behind each of those and trying to construct, first of all, who fits what picture. So let's say there's a clinical trial, Trailose, looking at lysosomes, who has lysosomal problems versus where is it really mitochondria? Where is it really endoplasmic reticulum? What if we could take the different medications and really figure out what they're doing in the cell? What if we could put them in unique combinations to move things down the cell? And using a lot of tests in order to determine it. So testing to, number one, look at that theory. Is this primarily that area of the cell in this individual? If it is, then this medication, would that be a reasonable approach? And again, working with Dr. Farrow, looking at the safety and efficacy, looking at how things get combined, and looking at what we would expect to see as far as improvements. Since the time with Gunther, a lot of people will ask me, how come we don't put more information out about people that have been stable for long periods of time? Keep in mind, we started in 2019, right? So that's the length of time that we really have in this area. As far as the next person that reversed, it was recognized in Europe. It's somebody that doesn't live here in the country. So that was a reversal that was recognized in late 2020. After 9 months, and the most recent that hasn't been recognized as a reversal yet. We're just waiting for that. That was a person that came in 2020 that looked to go into, I think remission for me is a more comfortable term than reversal. Remission is control over disease. Reversal is a term that's commonly used. Duke uses it as they recognize patients. For me, again, remission is a little more comfortable. So those three. And then the reason I decided to do the webinar today, because we're having, questions come in all the time. And I thought to let you know, I routinely talk to clinicians and describe what it is that we're doing. It would be our hope that more and more people receive some type of therapy for this disease. And it is my belief that this is a cellular damage that's affecting motor neurons that responds to treatment. Now, again, I would tell you as my disclaimer, I'm not a physician, and I'm not claiming that we are successfully treating ALS. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is I think motor neuron damage is something that can be treated. And I think the first step is identifying what's causing that damage. And so the approach that we take is trying to understand with each person. And so I'm going to start us off. Sam is over here to my right, and she has agreed to, as people are asking questions, let me know so I can answer them for you. But the first question I want to answer is, why do we do a Zoom call before anybody can schedule to come on over to the office? The Zoom call, it takes about an hour. There's a place on the website where you can sign up for it. The cost for that hour is $350. Here's why we do it. The question is, can we as a center get an understanding of why somebody has damage to their motor neurons? If we can't get a clear idea, at least a hypothesis, then we do not have a direction. We do not want to drag somebody from around the world or around the country over here and then tell you, hey, we don't think that we can have an impact. And so the objective of that hour conversation is very specifically looking at a timetable. When did the first symptom occur? What was the first symptom? How long until the next symptom? I would tell you, there is a big difference in our estimation of the center as with somebody that starts, for example, right hand and then left hand versus right hand and then right foot versus right hand and then speech. So how things are moving, changing, progressing becomes very, very important. And in that timetable, constructing potential exposures or illnesses. Did you travel outside of your own country? Have you ever been in the military? Were you sick at any point? Did you take any kind of medications during those times? Were there any professional exposures? Did you work in a job that's high exposure? Did you live in a place where there are Superfund sites or areas of extreme contamination? Are there a lot of other people in that area that have motor neuron disease? So in other words, is it an area there is a cluster? So that first call is when we strategize and get a very clear idea of what are we trying to do, right? We're not trying to treat motor neuron disease. That's the symptom. We're trying to treat the underlying cause of why somebody has motor neuron damage. And here's my question. I'm going to ask it for Sam. I don't know if what everybody wants to do at this point is go through questions. I want to make sure that we have enough time. I also put 3 slides together. And the reason for this 3 slides is to describe what I believe is the role that infections are playing in damage that can ultimately impact motor neurons. And so, Sam, you tell me if we've got a bunch of questions, I'll switch to questions. If not, I'll switch to slides.
So I do have one question.
Okay.
What is treatment? What is the treatment?
All right. So it's a really common question. I don't know if you guys heard. The question is, what is treatment? Just know we don't have a specific treatment. Okay. The reason I say that is not because I'm trying to withhold information. Right? Instead, what I would tell you is I would need a little bit more information to understand. And now going back to, why did you develop motor neuron disease? Are we talking about infections? Okay. If infections are playing a role, are they bacterial, viral, or fungal? Was it, instead of an infection, more of a chemical exposure? If so, what is the chemical? Are there halides in that mix? And are we talking about halide toxicity? Is there something that modified genetics? And so I could be clear, and usually the reason for the Zoom is to get really clear. I do not believe that motor neuron damage is a single disease. I believe that people are developing damage to motor neurons for an infinite number of reasons, commonly a genetic predisposition, possibly as a poor detoxifier. And oftentimes we'll run that lab. Is it phase 1, phase 2, and or detoxification error in combination with a chemical exposure that required phase 1 to work properly? So I'll give you an example. Is it excessive diesel exposure in an individual that has a cytochrome P450 1B1 mutation, right? So let's say that person develops motor neuron. It's going to be very, very different than somebody that has diesel exposure, but is much better at metabolizing volatile organic carbons or diesel or petroleum. And so I would give you an answer if I had it. If we were talking about a case study, and from time to time, I definitely do case study presentations, then I am happy to say, these are the labs, this is what we know about this person, this is our suspected hypothesis as to what's causing damage, and for that reason, this is the approach that we took. So what we have is a fairly sizable toolbox. The way that we built that toolbox, again, it's looking at things that have been discussed and trialed because of the benefit that was shown in literature or in white paper studies, meaning people that had already tried it on a handful of people. So we already know that there is merit, but the question is for whom? And the objective initially is to get an idea of who you are. And I'll normally refer to it as getting to know you. Getting to know you is what are the most likely causes that are impacting motor neuron damage? When did they occur? Does your progression speak to the same? If in fact we think that that's the cause and we look to treat that. So as an example, let's say that we think that there may be a role of certain viruses, and then we test that hypothesis by going after those viruses. Do we see improvement, right? Because that for us is going to then confirm the hypothesis and allow us to move further in that direction. And so getting to know you, in my estimation, is taking a look, coming up with the hypothesis of why we think things are causing motor neuron damage. What was your exposure professionally? What was your exposure residentially? Where have you traveled to? When did you get sick? What happened in the couple of years prior to you getting sick? Again, were you on medications? Or any of those medications known to be toxic? Going through all of that, and then coming up with the original or the initial hypothesis of, okay, then we think as a team, right? The reason that motor neuron damage occurred was secondary to blank. Okay? And we will customize a strategy for each person, and we will watch each day to see the response. So we could have 20 people in the office today, and all 20 of them will likely be on a very, very different protocol. So remember, I recognize the reason for the question, which is either to try and find it at home, to do it. Just know if we had a specific protocol, we would have already put it out there. There is nothing as a center that we would like more than to see across the globe more response when it comes to motor neuron treatment. Remember, again, it's not about matching treatment by just checking off the box. We did this treatment. Instead, it's who are you? Why are motor neurons being devastated? How do you respond to different treatments? Each of those treatments, what is it designed to do in the cell? And your response giving us an indication of, is that at the level of the cell, at the organelle that we need to be at? Is that the pathway that we are trying to get a handle on? And sometimes, and I know, Sam, you'd asked me to talk about peptides briefly. Sometimes we will use peptides for that. They are cellular signalers, right? Amino acid strings. We'll use all kinds of different tools. For us, they are all just widgets. And so really what we have is a large toolbox filled with all kinds of different options, and then looking to find the right match for each person once we can get a clear idea of the likely causes. And also taking a step back, it's not just a hypothesis. I mean, we will look to verify it. And so we will look to confirm diagnosis. We'll run pathogen panels to confirm that was the infection. We'll look at inflammatory cytokines, knowing, for example, I had somebody, herpes simplex 1 seemed like it was playing a role. If that's the case, we should see an elevation in interleukin 15. We'll test all the inflammatory cytokines, and sure enough, in that lab, interleukin 15 was the elevation. So again, we're not just going to kind of haphazardly throw a guess out there. We're going to test, see if we can confirm it. We're going to look at it from multiple different angles. Do T cells suggest the same? Do inflammatory cytokines suggest the same? What area of the cell would then be damaged? If we signal that area, what will we see? So just know we go from that vantage point.
I do have a very good question.
Okay.
It's a little long. So it starts with, what diseases does this clinic treat?
What diseases do we treat?
If we have any knowledge on opt-in gene with rubbing alcohol usage, also mosquito spraying, and maybe some HVV viruses and SIBO.
Okay, so I'm going to write this down. Hang on. Who sent the question in? Do we put a shout out?
We have
Yes, no? Okay, Sam says no. I would say hi to you, but I don't know who it is. Okay, so we're trying to look for herpetics, the role of herpetics.
Correct.
Okay, what was the other part?
Of the gene with rubbing alcohol usage, mosquito spraying,
Mosquito spraying,
HPV virus, and SIBO.
SIBO. Okay, all right, it's a lot. Let's start with mosquito spraying. What we know is that there's a large class action lawsuit right now against one of the pesticide companies. Mosquito spraying, depending on the kind of material that they're using, has been associated with a number of neuroinflammatory diseases, primarily Parkinson's. So the studies over there, motor neuron disease and Parkinson's are occurring in two different areas of the brain. Motor neuron ALS, you're really looking front of the brain and you're looking at the spinal cord, right? Horn cells. When you're thinking about mosquito spraying and pesticide, they can be very, very neuroinflammatory. They are neurotoxins. That's how they kill insects. So that's their mechanism of action. So imagine you can kill an insect with a neurotoxin. You could probably impact a human with that same neurotoxin. Its mechanism is the same. But specifically, and because you're asking about mosquito spraying, so not just pesticide and fungicide as a group of chemicals, but mosquito spraying. What we know, the kind of chemicals that are in mosquito pesticides oftentimes cause damage in the basal ganglia or midbrain. Specifically, those chemicals can destroy the dopaminergic cells in the substantia nigra. That is kind of the pathophysiology of Parkinson's. And so it's not to say that mosquito spraying in particular could not cause neuroinflammation in other areas, both for the central and peripheral nervous system. Had you asked about pesticides and fungicides as a class, my answer would be different. But because you're likely, again, reading specifically about mosquito spraying, paraquat, those kinds of things, we're talking commonly about dopaminergic or dopamine destroying pesticides that reduce the count and functionality of the dopamine cells in the substantia nigra. And so basal ganglia is going to code for a lot of movement, walking around, motion in general. And so you're going to see changes. And so whether the change is stiffness, bradykinesia, lack of motion, akinesia, those kinds of symptoms are associated with midbrain, basal ganglia, dopaminergic changes. And that's what's most associated with mosquito spraying. Okay, the second was role of herpetics. The third is SIBO. I'm going to just go over SIBO first. Small intestine bacterial overgrowth. It's a test that people can take. It's normally breath. You're looking at a couple of different gases and how they're moving through the intestines. Here's what we know. We know a bunch of microflora shouldn't leave the large intestine and start populating the small intestine. And so when you're talking about the small intestine being overgrown by what's traditionally healthy or commensal microflora, but in the wrong location, small intestine, I mean, it can cause a number of health problems. Remember, on our side, so you're hearing a biased approach from somebody that is in a center where we're more about root cause than outcome. Then meaning not just what the result is, in this case SIBO, but the underlying cause. And so commonly SIBO can occur from antibiotic use. It can even occur from overuse of probiotics. A lot of times we find when we do a 3-day stool and we're looking at the large intestine, we see all kinds of large intestine damage, either over or undergrowth of healthy commensal microflora, or eradication of healthy microflora, or pathogens that have started to grow in the large intestine. I'll tell you the link between that and motor neuron disease. Remember, the colon is the area where butyrate is primarily synthesized. So butyrate is the AMX clinical trial, right? Sodium phenylbutyrate is that material. There are 3 short chain fatty acids that are made in the colon. So what happens is you digest certain fibers, and the commensal microflora, there are a handful of different families, Akkermansia being one of them, takes that fiber and process it into short chain fatty acids. You've got three of them, right? Propionate, acetate, butyrate. The one that is really important for motor neurons is butyrate. That's why that AMX trial now has led to the FDA approved use of butyrate. Those were the early studies. Think about this, 2020, showing a 24-week trial on butyrate, and the improvement in fine motor coordination just being one of the things that was found. So the question is, if you do not have a healthy microflora, if you do not have healthy intestines, so whether we're talking about large intestine and the role that it's going to play in creating butyrate, which is very important for cellular function, whether we're talking about the overgrowth of good guys that have become bad guys in the small intestine, the long and short is the gut needs to have adequate health, both for nutritional absorption and to prevent the kind of dysfunction that is associated with disease. The CDC came out a while ago and they made a statement. I think this is true. If somebody was going to have to fact check this, I think it was the CDC, it may have been the NIH. What they did was they associated microflora both in diversity, so how many different families do you have, and count how much of each do you have, with health or disease. And essentially what they said as a general statement, the lower the amount of microflora and the lower the diversity, the higher the risk of disease in a population. And I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. So you don't want commensal microflora, so traditionally considered to be good guys, overgrowing in places where they don't belong. And you don't want dysbiosis, meaning a disproportionate balance in the large intestine. And so I would tell you, if what you have is something that is contributing to poor health in the gut, it ideally gets corrected. Oh, and my last was herpetics. So we believe as a center that infections play a central role in neuroinflammation. So inflammation in the central nervous system and peripheral as well. And we have found that herpetics in particular, so herpes simplex 1, 2, Epstein-Barr, cytomegalo, herpes simplex 6, 7 and 8 are around, but not nearly as associated with neuroinflammation. We have found that controlling those infections looks to improve neuroinflammation. And so I would tell you, as a center, we strongly believe that controlling infections, whether we're talking about bacterial in the form of Lyme, whether we're talking about enteroviruses and Coxsackie, whether we're talking about parasites like toxoplasma and its known role in motor neuron disease, or whether we're talking about viruses. And so the real question becomes, how do you prioritize what infections? Again, we are a medical strategy team. That's who we are. And so we're always going to start by counting. And so we're going to get a better understanding of which infections, what percent of a total infection load they're playing, which ones look to be more virulent or disease causing than others. We're going to prioritize them based on that. And then we're going to organize that list, your list of your antibodies, your immune system, attacking these infections. We're going to then prioritize that. And taking a step back, how we got to that, I did not have a clear focus on herpes family of viruses until this last maybe year and a half, when it became very evident the role that Epstein-Barr plays in multiple sclerosis. And so prior to that, oh, tell me, Sam.
Yes. So
wait, Sam's got something for us.
On what you said, which interleukin is high in HB?
Okay, hang on. So Sam's question is, let's talk interleukins, but let me just tell you this viral component first, and specifically herpetics. Here's what I thought. I think everybody was kind of under the same impression from the medical or scientific community. If something is active, so immunoglobulin class M, then it's active and it's actively causing disease. And after you've already had exposure to a virus, a herpes virus, for example, and it's no longer IgM mediated, instead your immune system is just kind of watching it, but not seeing it as an acute or active infection. So that's immunoglobulin G. everybody had thought that it's not disease causing. So unless the immune system sees it as an acute infection, and so unless you can measure IgM levels to that infection, chances are it is not causing active disease. It's not causing disease. When the studies came out for multiple sclerosis and the very, very clear link that Epstein-Barr as a herpetic is playing, it changed things, because the way that old theory would have played out is, in order to develop these diseases from that virus, the virus would have to show as IgM activity year after year, but it doesn't. And so what we're really seeing is people ultimately develop the disease of neuroinflammation and scarring after extended periods of time in an IgG status of infections. And I think it was that study about a year and a half ago where I looked at it and thought, wait a second, herpetics are very neuroinflammatory enough that they could be linked to multiple sclerosis. And that's when the data came out as well, linking Epstein-Barr to a number of the other things that we had seen: rheumatoid arthritis, irritable bowel disease, celiac, juvenile, idiopathic arthritis, so kids that have arthritis but for no known reason, and even a link with atrial fibrillation. And that for me changed everything, and it brought viruses, and specifically the herpes families, a family of viruses, front and center. And that's when we decided as a center about a year and a half ago to start looking at herpetics as a target, as a therapy target, and we found significant improvements as a result. And it changed how we treated diseases of neuroinflammation. And so I've got a number of case studies just showing the decreases in herpetics, both IgG and IgM, and showing functional improvements occurring as those levels come down. And so we definitely treat Lyme. So bacterial infections that are tick-borne, we definitely treat herpetics. And again, as a center, we see them as playing a pivotal role in a significant number of diseases. All right, tell me, Sam. Oh, interleukins?
Yes.
All right. So we're in the world of the immune system. We're talking now about inflammatory cytokines. And so just to orient, a lot of people have already tested things like C-reactive protein. Sometimes you'll see it as a high sensitivity, or HSCRP. They'll test a SED rate. So just to kind of give an idea, that's acute inflammation. By comparison, inflammatory cytokines, we're talking about the chronic immune system. And so the chronic immune system turns on. It should not stay on. The body should not perceive a problem that it cannot fix and continue to pump out proteins, creating inflammation. But in certain situations, it does. And so, for example, an infection that it just can't get a handle on. So it will continue making inflammatory cytokines. Imagine the inflammatory cytokine, it's designed to try and attack and kill the infection. But I mean, it's going to cause problems all over the place. Commonly, inflammasomes is a term that's used, meaning, I mean, it's going to make inflammation. And so whether inflammation is in the form of, well, I don't even know what direction I was going to go in. What I was going to say is sometimes people might have a fever, sometimes they might have swelling, sometimes people might have redness, sometimes they don't have any of those because the chronic inflammatory cytokines aren't able to be seen. You could measure them. Sometimes the inflammatory cytokines will trigger psoriasis or eczema. Sometimes the inflammatory cytokines will trigger difficulty breathing or more phlegm. So what you have is a body building a fire to try and burn down whatever it perceives to be a problem. Sometimes the problem is an infection. Sometimes it's not. The body has a very limited number of tools to treat what has become an infinite number of assaults, right? So there's a lot of man-made chemicals and a lot of infections that a body may not really have a clear understanding of how to go after. And so you will escalate or elevate the type of inflammatory cytokine and the number of inflammatory cytokines and the combination of inflammatory cytokines, the more panicked the body becomes because it cannot effectively get control over something it may recognize, an infection, something it may not recognize, an infection, or something it's never seen before, a chemical. And so again, making that statement, body has a very limited number of tools in its arsenal to try and impact or destroy a lot of things that it does not understand, diesel being one of them. And so, interestingly, inflammatory cytokines don't always, but commonly have a location that they are trying to protect. And so, to say that differently, interleukin 1 alpha and 1 beta. You're commonly going to see interleukin 1 elevations when people have gut related issues. This is a generality. It's still an accurate and reasonable generality, but it's still a generality. So for anybody that's going to say, I've got interleukin 1 and I don't have gut stuff, just know, again, it's a generality, but it's a pretty common one. And here's the thing, interleukin 1, so a gut that's become inflamed, the cells will start making interleukin 1. Interleukin 1 commonly will trigger skin-related changes. So now we're talking about autoantibodies attacking things. We're in the world of psoriasis and eczema. And so there is no surprise that controlling interleukin 1 is a therapy target of a number of medications looking to control things like eczema and psoriasis. All right, so it kind of gives you a bigger picture. Interleukin 17, by comparison, not always liver, but commonly liver. And you're looking at these not just as proteins, but as signalers. So the question is, if the liver is going to be responsible for trying to clear toxins, and the common or the way that the liver is going to eliminate those toxins is in the stool. So the liver is going to take toxins and put them in the intestines. When the intestines become inflamed, because of all the toxins that you're trying to eliminate, can it then speak to the liver and say, hey, liver, look, stop filtering all these toxins? It can, through a chain of inflammatory cytokines. So interleukin 1 can be the signal that goes back from the intestines to the liver to say, hey, we've had enough. You could measure it in blood and we can get a clear idea of what might be going on and localized, but no, in a body, the reason it's making this, number one, to try and control something bad by making a bunch of inflammation, but number two, as a source of communication. So it's going to then go back to the liver, right, through that signaling pathway and say, hey, liver, stop filtering, stop putting things into the intestines. And then the liver might turn on interleukin 17, right, as a signal to the rest of the body to say, okay, we are now all going to find a much higher level of toxins because we don't have an elimination pathway. And then at that point, you might actually see interleukin 23 turn on as cells in the body are now adjusting to what they expect next, which is a storm of toxic mess. So sometimes you're measuring them, and to go back for herpes simplex 1, we were talking about the fact that interleukin 15 can be something that shows up for HSV1. Again, just know bodies are using different tools for different infections. Also, bodies are using different tools in order to signal different areas and describe what's going to happen next. And so for us, we're going to measure inflammatory cytokines to get a better understanding of the health of the immune. We are also going to look at lymphocytes, so T cells primarily, to understand what does your army look like. So the inflammatory cytokine, those are the big guns that are calling the shots. The general that's saying the next place that we're going to go to war is this specific location, this country, this area of that country, and this is how many soldiers I want lined up over there. Those are your inflammatory cytokines. Your lymphocytes, your T cells, those are the army that's going out to fight. We will measure them because if there aren't enough soldiers, or if it's the wrong group, so think about Army, ground troops, Navy, of course, in the water. If you send Navy, but you need ground troops, you're not going to accomplish very much. If you send Air Force, but you need boots on the ground. And so we're going to look at what T cells are doing, right? The regulatories, are you looking to help cells get better? Are you looking to burn things to the ground with natural killers? And so just know the inflammatory cytokines are one part of the picture. Antibodies and what your immune system is making antibodies to, T cells, and whether you're trying to help or kill, that starts becoming the full picture in combination with the list of infections or pathogens that are on board, their levels and the interplay that they have in combination with the chemicals and the exposures. If you have certain metals on board that are triggering the replication of certain infections, we will look at those levels of metals and even minerals, things that are considered to be healthy, to try and get a clear idea of who is trying to replicate, and then put priority on those pathogens. So it is a little bit of a complicated situation, not too complicated that you can't understand it. But on our side, again, really as medical strategists, I know it's common to say we're looking for root cause. I think it's been said, probably said too many times that it even has an impact. Instead of just saying we're looking for root cause, again, it's a question of putting a clear strategy together. If we think that we're going after infections, which one, how long, how do we want to do it? If we think we're going after chemicals, which ones? If we think the chemicals are driving replication of those infections, which direction do we want to go in? Hang on, we've got a question from Sam, so I'm going to take a look. Yes, Sam.
So we are 47 minutes in, and
Okay.
I do have a lot of questions.
Okay. I don't know if you guys can hear Sam. We're 47 minutes in, and we've got a bunch of questions. All right, so we've got 13 minutes. Let's jam through questions. All right, Sam.
Awesome. So most of the main questions is how many days is treatment, and is there a protocol to be continued when leaving?
Okay, I'm going to answer that. How many days for treatment, and is there a protocol? When we see somebody for the first time, that's the get to know you phase that we were talking about earlier. The question is, when you come in, what do you look like? Do you have good nutrition on board? How healthy are you? What do we need to do? And that first week, we will assess. If what we're trying to do is treat infections as an example, but we've got an immune system that really hasn't gotten what it needs, ingredients, nutrients, cofactors, then we will spend the initial week doing that. We as a center like to start with 3 weeks. Here's the reason. The first week to assess, we will typically run labs in that first week as well. If you have labs, we are of course going to encourage you to bring them so we can see the entire history. We're going to put a handful of things on board, some in order to build the ingredients for the reactions that we need to drive. If we need the immune system, how many ingredients are already on board for the immune system? If we're going to go down a different direction, do we have those ingredients? So we're going to spend part of that first week putting ingredients in place, and part of that week using different treatments to figure out how the cells are responding. Where is the problem in the cell? And using treatments as a way to isolate and figure that out. So week number 1. Week number 2, we go in now understanding how did you do on week number 1? Do we have enough ingredients that we can start running, reactions? How'd you do when we went over and knocked on the door of the mitochondria? How'd you do when we knocked on the door of the lysosome? How'd you do when we knocked on the door of the endoplasmic reticulum? What did it look like? So week number 2, we take that information, we start focusing on those different areas and putting different combinations together and looking to see how you respond. Week number 3, we already have a clear sense, and then we're going to change the frequency of what we're using daily, every other day, every couple of days, and even the dosing structure of it. And we're going to check in every single day to get a better understanding of how you're doing. When you come back, we are looking to do something very specific, and we'll know it from the first time. We're going to tell you, hey, here's what we found. First of all, here are the labs that we got back. Here's what we think is going on. Here's what we saw from this period of time. Here is what we would like to do next. Depending on what we're going to do next, that's going to dictate length of time, right? So I could answer the question a little bit better if we had a case study, and I can give you an example. I would tell you what we wanted to do next was treat 3 different viruses. We treated 1 per week, so we asked for 3 weeks. Or we were trying to treat 1 bacterial infection. We were able to do it in 1 week. So I could give you a clearer idea if I knew exactly what we were trying to do. Again, we will always look the first time, if we can, to get 3 weeks to really get clear. Sam, to your point about home protocols, we will look to take what has worked, create a home protocol from that, and put that on board. As far as supplements, we will commonly make suggestions or recommendations based on what we saw. So there is no one size fits all. Going back to, if we had 20 people here today, all 20 are likely going through a very different approach. All 20 will have something very different in their home protocol.
Awesome. And then what is the cost range of treatment, and when do they return?
Okay, cost of treatment and when do you return? Just know I'll go through it, and the website has a lot of this information as well. So cost of treatment, not discussing labs, not discussing if we needed something different, but just talking about day-to-day cost of treatment. The cost of treatment is $1,500 per day. It is largely the cost of medication. We know already these medications, this treatment, it is not covered by insurance. And so we use a number of different things, and the cost of the treatment is largely the payment for those medications. Again, $1,500 per day, it makes a week of $7,500. There are certain things that we'll do that do not require a charge. So let's say, for example, we build a genetic piece of material. When we put it in, there's nothing else that we're doing on that day. And so there's no charge for that day. You are charged essentially for what we use. What was the other part of it? I'm hoping that answered it. Again, it's on the website as well. No, we are constantly trying to get better control over cost. I know, having gone through a medical situation with my dad, right, how unfair it is to be in a situation where you find yourself without proper coverage, being in a category where there aren't things that are being considered medically necessary. We have been successful getting cost control knowing the number of medications and the amount that we use, but still it is much higher than we would like it to be. And so very recently, we just started last week a not-for-profit. So we had been working on doing that for, I think, about the last 3 months, and just got the paperwork for it. The reason for the not-for-profit, one, to bring on research assistants to try and get through the information faster and put a database together so we can actually see numbers, know each person, what are the infections, how fast could we treat them. But number two, in order to try and defray cost of treatment. And so I have my first fundraiser coming up. I've never done a fundraiser before, but Marianne Miller and her crew, so Ken Miller's 5 girls, put that together. It will be in Cincinnati. I think it's next weekend. We will take 100% of those proceeds and use them directly towards treatment cost. And so we are trying to find better ways to control the cost. Our option is not to reduce the medications, because we don't think that we'd be effective, but then to use funding to try and bring costs down for each person. And again, it's on the website. It will go through different costs of different things. All right, tell me, Sam.
So when do our patients return?
Oh, when do people return? It depends on what you have going on. So I know I've said it a couple of times. I hate to keep saying it, because here's the thing, you guys, if I actually had a case study, I would just walk you through. But let's say that there is an infection. What we're going to do is we're going to build out an infection treatment. We're going to know it during the first visit. We're going to get clear on what's going on. We're going to run labs. Most of the labs are going to come back. Anything that doesn't come back during that visit, we're going to get on a call. We're going to talk about, this is what we actually found. This was our hypothesis. This is what we found as a result. And this is what we want to do. Okay, based on that, it's going to dictate when you come back and how long you come back for. Going again with the example of, if we think it's a tick-borne infection that's leading to inflammation, we might tell you it'll take us about 5 weeks to get everything together for that. And then we'll ask you to come on back. It may just be 1 week of treatment. If we think that there are multiple viruses, I want to use the same example as before. So there's a lot of different things we're treating, but just, and let's say that there are 2 viruses, then we're probably talking about 2 weeks. If we're talking about as 3 viruses, we may be talking about 3 weeks. Keep in mind, Dr. Farrow is not on this call, but if he was here, the decision is going to be his. So as a medical director, as a medical doctor, always we're going to look at, or he's going to look at, safety profile and length of time between treatments. So that decision is not on the scientific side, that's on the medical side. And once we have labs and once we've seen response to treatment, that's when we can put it together. So before being discharged from the initial visit, that's when we will get together and go through, this is what we found, This is what we think is going on. These are our next steps. This is when we'd like you to come on back. And this is exactly what we expect to do during that time. And this is how long we'd like you for. So if it was something I could answer now, please know I would answer it. Instead, it's a case by case, depending on what looks to be the contributing factor or factors to neuroinflammation, what's the specific strategy we're going to use. And so for the folks, tomorrow's Friday, for the folks that are being discharged tomorrow, they will all know before they leave, but none of them would know before they got here because we don't know what is causing neuroinflammation. And again, there is no one size fits all that we have found as a center. Instead, it really is a question of understanding each thing. And once we've treated something and we can see the changes, the question is, what's the priority to treat next? And we may not know that until we've already crossed that first area and addressed that first set of problems. So each time that we see you, we're going to have a better understanding, and we will provide a summary of the labs, what we believe the implications are of the labs, what we are planning to do about it, the strategy. So no, we have that for each person, but we can't guess it out before somebody comes over here, given the wide variety of reasons that somebody could have neuroinflammation, and in this case, the resulting motor neuron damage. All right, let me do this. Let me see if I've got one more question from Sam, and then I think we're probably out of time.
So our last question of the day would be, is ALS a disease that is known to be hereditary?
Okay, so the question is ALS a hereditary disease? What we know from the literature, we know approximately 10% of cases are familial. I'm not sure how many cases are unreported or underreported. So I'm not sure anybody really knows if that number, how accurate it is. I think it is probably a pretty good guideline. When I look at genetics, when we look at them over here, we're not looking at the genetics for ALS. Instead, we're looking at the genetics for detoxification. So we're looking at phase 1, phase 2 liver detoxification. So going back to the example of diesel, we know that diesel exposure can increase the risk of developing ALS. The estimates are between 15 and 25%. Okay. The question is, in whom? And so if that's true, then how come diesel doesn't increase the risk in everybody? So we're looking at an aryl hydrocarbon receptor in individuals with a 1B1 mutation. So what I'm saying is there are a lot of pieces that fit into this. We are going to look at the genetics that describe how quickly or how slowly an individual would metabolize a certain toxin, meaning diesel may not cause motor neuron disease in everybody. If somebody was what's referred to as an ultra rapid metabolizer, so diesel gets in and then gets dumped into the bloodstream very quickly, gets metabolized by the liver, or an ultra slow metabolizer, right? So it keeps sticking around and doesn't get excreted. Those are commonly, either side of the spectrum, the people at the highest risk. The slow metabolizers commonly are the higher risk, right? Because they can't get rid of it. And then they have exposure again the next day, but they haven't metabolized the day before. And then they get exposure again. And so we'll look at what's essentially the speed of the liver through multiple different detoxification pathways. We will match that with chemicals, right, that are showing up either in your blood or as metabolites in the urine. And we'll get a better understanding of, yes, you may have come in contact with a lot of chemicals and everybody else has as well. Why, in your case, did it become neuroinflammatory? Genetically, what were you predisposed to? And the example I would give you, drinking coffee or drinking alcohol. So you pick whatever one feels like a better fit. I mean, some people can drink coffee at bedtime and sleep without a problem. Ultra slow metabolizers, right? So they have caffeine, but it doesn't hit them right away. Ultra rapid metabolizer, you drink caffeine and you feel wired right away. And then it goes away after a relatively short period of time. And then there's everybody else that's in the middle, right? They're called intermediate, or people that metabolize at the speed that's expected. Alcohol, same. I mean, some people will have one glass of wine and feel drunk like a skunk or super tired. And then somebody else is sitting next to them having glass after glass of wine or whatever other alcohol. And they'll make comments like, I'm the greatest drinker ever. I've got the best liver ever. But what you're really looking at, you're not really looking at size of liver or who has the best, prettiest liver. You're looking at metabolic speed. and how you are changing essentially the half-life of that ingredient. The same is true for pharmaceuticals, right? That's why some people get side effects and other people don't. It's the interactions with other things and the speed of metabolism. And that is largely being controlled by the cytochrome P450 enzymes in phase 1 and the pathways of phase 2. And so going back to the question, approximately 10%, that's the estimate of individuals that have ALS had a familial or genetic predisposition specifically for pathways that can have become damaged. It's horrible grammar, and lead to motor neuron damage. For the other people, right, we are likely looking at the ability or inability to safely remove toxins. And throwing one more thing over there, the ARYL, the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, right, critical for diesel, but that receptor, its job is to control T cells. So would you expect somebody that has had modifications to the ARYL receptor as a result of diesel to be less able to manage through viral infections because they cannot make T cells adequately because of the change in that receptor? So the only reason I put that out there is it is, it's complicated. And again, not so complicated that it can't be understood, but it is more than just genetics and more than just a receptor pathway, a STAT3 pathway for antiviral. Instead, it's kind of the viruses, speeds that things are going to deliver, combinations of toxins. And remember, for everybody that has motor neuron damage, chances all are everybody has it for a different reason, a different combination of those things, a different combination of genetics in the liver, talking about detoxification, a different combination of exposures, a different combination of receptors like the ARYL or aryl hydrocarbon receptor modifications, a different number of infections that now require that receptor to function, a different combination of how those infections become something new, different genetics predisposing for neuroinflammation. And so on our side, again, really at the core, being medical strategists, right? Our goal is to try and understand that in each case of neuroinflammation and the other diseases that we treat in order to start coming up with a strategy of what we're going to do next. All right, Sam, I think that's it. We're out of time. I want to be respectful for the hour. And so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm hoping this is helpful. On a Zoom, you can't really tell. You're just kind of talking out into outer space and hoping people are going, yeah, that makes sense. Even if everybody's going, that makes no sense. You can't see it on my side. And so again, I would tell you, I'm hoping that this is going to be helpful. My goal is to try and do more of these. I know there is a huge demand for information out there. Because of our success rate, we know it is incumbent on us to share information. And so as a team, we are trying to make concerted focus and the time set it aside to make sure that people have this information and that other places know what we're doing as well. So I can't quite tell you when the next call will be. Sam and I were talking about trying to do this once a week. I don't know if our schedule permits. At the very least, we will very definitely, I think that was twice for the word very in the same sentence, get there once a month. If anybody has suggestions of what you'd like to talk about, send it to us. There's nothing I'd like better than to discuss the specifics that you want to talk about. Going back to, could we be very specific about a case? I think we'll need a case study to do that, but on our side, we don't have any problem doing that as well. So until next time, take care of yourselves. What we'll look to do is come up with a link and advise our next call. If we can do it next Thursday at 1:00, because we were talking about that, then we will make that announcement on Monday. If we can't, then we will at least by Monday put out something on our Facebook group that at least lets you know when we'll do the next one. All right. And keep an eye out for our not-for-profit. I think we're going to see a significant amount of traction over there. And I think we are going to be able to impact the amount of treatments that we can do as a result and get some cost containment even further than we have now. So be on the lookout for that. And we'll stay in touch. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.